name is Jason Jabari. I'm here to present student debt forgiveness would impact nearly every aspect of people's lives. I'm proud to present on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Stephen Roll and Dr. McCall Grinstein-Weiss, and we're presenting at the Social Policy Institute at Washington University in St. Louis. In this study, we asked participants to imagine a scenario in which the federal government forgave some amount of their student debt. Then we asked questions to see how this would affect their decisions and behaviors. We relied on a sample of 1,009 student debt holders from a nationally representative survey. We randomized on 4 different treatment conditions. In the first condition, we asked individuals to imagine a situation in which the federal government forgave $5,000 of student debt. In the second condition, $10,000. In the third condition, $20,000. And in the fourth condition, all student debt was forgiven. To preview our findings, debt forgiveness in general matters in the financial and social lives of borrowers. The amount of debt forgiveness also matters, and the proportion of debt forgiveness matters as well. Here, the proportion is related to the amount of debt forgiven relative to the amount of debt held by individuals. When considering the most common behaviors associated with debt forgiveness, we see 4 major areas. In the left column, we see saving more for retirement. In the middle column here, we see paying down other debts and saving more for a down payment on a home. And on the right column, we see saving more for emergencies. To summarize, the large proportions of student debt holders reported that they would pay down other debts, save more for emergencies, save for a down payment on a home, and save more for retirement. When considering the amount of student debt forgiven, we also see some interesting trends. In the left column, we see that increases in the amount of debt forgiven relate to making large purchases, like a car or appliance, and returning to school. In the right column, we see an increase in student debt forgiven relates to saving more for emergencies and purchasing more or better food. Moreover, here in the left column, we see that the amount of student debt forgiven was not strongly associated with working less. We also see student debt holders are more likely to save for retirement if all of their student debt was forgiven. In the right column, student debt holders were twice as likely to report that they would have a child if they received $10,000 as opposed to $5,000. Again, to summarize, higher levels of student debt forgiveness were associated with purchasing more or better food, making large purchases, a car or appliance, returning to school, and saving more for emergencies. Moreover, we see that saving more for retirement is often a product of having all student debt forgiven. Individuals are more likely to have a child with increases in debt forgiveness. And again, the amount of student debt forgiven was not strongly associated with working less. Finally, when considering the proportion of student debt forgiven, we found some interesting trends as well. In the left column, 10% of respondents who had 50% or more of their student debt forgiven would work less, compared to almost no one having 25% or less of their debt forgiven. We also see the respondents were more likely to return to school when the proportion exceeds 50%. In the middle column, we see that respondents having less than half of their debt forgiven were much more likely to report paying down other debts than those with higher proportions of debt forgiven. And finally, in the right column, respondents became much more likely to report they would save for emergencies once the proportion of their student debt forgiven exceeded 25%. Moreover, here in the right column, we see that when the proportion of debt forgiven increased, individuals were much more likely to have a child and much more likely to report starting a business. To summarize, only about 10% of respondents who had more than 50% of their student debt forgiven would work less. And almost no one having 25% or less of their debt forgiven would work less. Respondents having less than half their student debt forgiven were more likely to report paying down other debts. And respondents became much more likely to report that they would save for emergencies once the proportion of their student debt forgiven exceeded 25%. Respondents were also more likely to return to school when the proportion exceeds 50%. Finally, for respondents who had all of their debt forgiven, they were much more likely to have a child and much more likely to report starting a business. Here are some implications. Here we see that student debt forgiven would impact nearly every aspect of life. This relates to economic stability, such as emergency savings, as well as social mobility, such as starting a business. We also see that the amount and proportion of debt forgiven matters. Setting a student debt forgiveness target too low may not lead to broad-based changes in households' economic behaviors. At the same time, setting a student debt forgiveness amount at a point where the average debt holder would have more than a quarter of their debt forgiven may yield large changes in savings behaviors, human capital investments, business startups. At the same time, we know that this would likely not lead to large changes in the supply of labor. Folks would not simply work less. Currently, there's a large question, and that is, how should policymakers forgive debt? How much should they forgive? For who? And overall, should they forgive debt at all? Here we see two different strategies often discussed. The first strategy involves a universal approach, where all debt is forgiven. Opponents of this strategy suggest that this may not be equitable. This could play out as luxuries for higher earners. The other strategy is a targeted approach, where targeted debt forgiveness is given to lower income individuals and individuals meeting other characteristics. However, this does not consider the far reaches of student debt, as some would argue. Again, student debt may not only be an issue for low income earners, and forgiving student debt could also stimulate the economy. In our study, we also found that there may be a third option that is less talked about in the policy landscape. What would a proportional approach look like? Here, all individuals could have a proportion of their student debt forgiven, and this proportion could increase for lower income individuals. This could address the equity concerns of those advocating for a more targeted approach, while still providing real and substantial benefits to student debt holders across the income spectrum. I'd like to thank everyone for their time and listening to our presentation. You can find the full report on Brookings.com. Thank you so much.